Alrighty, welcome back, boys and girls. It's your main math man, Miss Shank, coming to you live from Alameda International High School. And in this video, we're going to be working on some functions warm-up / review, kind of get back into the swing of things, working on that coordinate plane and working with those linear functions. So in the first one, it says to graph the following ordered pairs. So what you want to do, as always, make sure you can kind of remind yourself how those ordered pairs work. So again, if you have an ordered pair, that's just going to be an x and a y value, which means this: when you are moving in the x direction, you're going to move left for negative and right for positive. For the y values, however, we're going to say we're going to move up or down, where up is positive and down is negative. You can make sure you're reminding yourself of that. Also remember, always going to start at the point 0, 0. So we're always going to start at that origin for ourselves when we go to plot these points. So when it says to graph the point 4, 2, I can label this as our first point A. So when I'm going to find the point A, I have to go 4 steps to the right. So go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I go 2 steps up. Make sure you plot the point directly in the corner and label it as point A. For the point 0, 3, we're going to say, okay, we're going to go 0 steps left or right, so we actually stay right where we're at, and then we go 3 steps up. So 1, 2, 3, and plot that point. And then lastly, we have, let's say it's point B, and lastly, we have the point -2, 4. So we go 2 steps left, 1, 2, and then 4 steps up. Again, make sure to label it B, or sorry, no, let's label that C actually. Label that C since that's a letter we haven't used yet. So then it says, again, make sure you can label those points each and every time. And then lastly, you can say, all right, does this graph above form a linear function? You want to write a complete sentence that justifies your reasoning. So how do we know? Well, you can always check. Let me do it like this. So let's say this, if we are looking at this, these ordered pairs have to form a straight line to be a linear function. So if we look at these values and we kind of made a line starting with these first 2 points, it would have to be going along that way, which is not the case. So we know that it is not a function. So let me write it like this. We can say, let's say it like this. We'd say these points do not form a linear function since they, let's say they do not make a straight line. So real simple, always make sure that if you're talking about a linear function, it has to be a straight line. So in this case, we could say it does not make a straight line. So therefore it's not a linear function. So again, always back up your statements with solid facts. Then in that second column, it has graph the function y equals 3x minus 2 using the function table below and the coordinate plane. So again, make sure you can see how this works. We have our function, we have a column of x values, a column of y values, and where it says rule, we're going to actually write this right side of this function. So we're going to say, all right, in the center we have 3x minus 2. And what I can do is, instead of x, I can write those parentheses. So like this, I'm going to say 3 times and then minus 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to place that x value in where those parentheses are. Again, we're using parentheses to show multiplication. And so usually I like to pick these numbers for x. Again, you choose what you want to put into the function, but depending on what you put into the function, so the y values depend on what you put into the function. So again, I plug in these values, so I have -1, for my first point. And so I say 3 times a -1 is going to be a -3. And I say -2 is going to be a -5. Plug in your next point for x equals 0. And then you say 3 times 0 is 0, -2 is a -2. So kind of notice the pattern as the x values are increasing by 1, our y values are increasing by 3, which is how we get our slope. And then lastly, plug in the value of x equals 1. So then 3 times 1 is 3, 3 minus 2 is 1. So we now have our ordered pairs. So all we're going to do is plot these points and draw a line. So as always, start at the origin. So I go 1 step to the left, 5 steps down, plot the point, 0 steps left to right, 2 steps down, and then, so for the point 1, 1, we go 1 step to the right and 1 step up. So now that I have my 3 points, I can draw up my line. Again, we're talking about a function, so you want to make sure you're drawing that straight line. If at any point in time you notice, hey, my points do not form a straight line, probably need to go back, double check your work, make sure that you are plotting them carefully. So once we have a line, again, make sure you can draw those points through it. Also too, some things to remember, like I said, I am increasing on the y-axis by 3, so if you need to make that staircase, I'm moving up 3 for every step to the right. So for every 1 step to the right, I move 3 steps up, which is how we get our pattern. All right, moving on to that top right one, it says the table of values below represents a linear relationship. What is the slope and y-intercept for this line? So remember what these are saying. So anytime we have slope, again, that's going to be so again, always slope is going to be the change in y values divided by the change in x values. So we're always going to have that as our definitions for slope. So always write it as a fraction. That way you can plug in those values. Again, one set of values for the change in y and one set of value for the change in x. So we're going to say, all right, what's our change in y? So from one point to the next, what is it? Well, if we have 4 and we're going down to 2, we have to say it's -2. So our change in y is going to be -2. However, for the change in x, what do we have? Well, if we're going from -4 to 0, we're actually increasing. So we're increasing by 4 for the change in x. So make sure you can say, all right, we're going to have -2 over a +4, which we can simplify to be -1 over 2. And then it says what is going to be that y-intercept. Again, that's the point where x equals 0. Whatever that value is, we're going to say y is equal to b. So we have that y-intercept. Again, that's where our graph of our line hits the y-axis. So make sure you can either use a highlighter if you're given the graph or the table. That way you can kind of highlight where x equals 0. And so we're going to say our y-intercept is going to be 2 for this one. So make sure you have those 2 items. Now we have to write that equation and graph it. So let me scroll down to the bottom here. Excuse me. So it has always in the form y equals mx plus b. And so we're going to say, all right, wherever we have m, that's our slope. Wherever we have b, that's our y-intercept. And so we're going to replace these variables with those values. So you say y equals -1/2 times x and then plus 2. So notice how 1/2 or -1/2 is our slope m and our b is our y-intercept of +2. Now we can graph it. So again, we went from the table to the equation to the graph. And so now we can say, all right, plot these points out. So we have -4, +4, so 4 steps left, 4 steps up. We have 0, 2, so 0 and then 2 steps up. And we have 4 to the right and 0 up. So then we can say, all right, we have our linear function, draw that line out like so. You can use a straight edge, back of calculator, whatever works best for you. Super simple. Again, feel free to pause, ask questions as they arise. All right, on the back, it has this. It says graph the table of values. Does it form a linear function? A couple ways to approach this. I can plot the points and then see, hey, what's the, do they line up? Do they make a straight line? Or I can also say, well, do these form a pattern? So let's graph out these points. So for that first ordered pair, again, I go 1 step to the left, 5 steps down. I have 1 step to the right, 1 step down. I have 2 steps to the right, 1, 2, and then 1 step up for my next point. And lastly, I have 4 steps to the right and 5 steps up. So let's kind of see, well, they have to be on a straight line. And if you notice, even though they're kind of separated, they do form a straight line. And a way we can check that is like this. We'd say, all right, well, it should have a pattern like this. I should be able to say if we are moving 1 step in the change of x, we're moving 2 steps in the y direction. So that means for every 2 steps up we go, so +2, we go 1 step to the right, and we have a point, which is exactly what we have. And so again, if you need to make that staircase, please do. That way it's a little bit easier to see. Again, 2 steps up, 1 step to the right, 2 steps up, 1 step to the right every time. So again, make sure you can make that staircase if you need to. Otherwise, we can say, yes, these points, we can say these points, oh boy, form a straight line. All right. Underneath of that, it has given the line on the graph, what is the slope and y-intercept. So now we're going from the graph, we want to be able to identify some items. So super easy, highlight that y-axis. And so I'm going to say this, if my graph of my line is this green function, where does my green line hit my highlighted y-axis? So always, so where it hits y-axis. So where it hits the y-axis. So if we notice very simply, hey, it's at that point -2, and so our y-intercept is -2. Already halfway done just by looking at the graph. So now we can say, all right, we need to find the next point where it is in a corner. So we say, hey, it's directly in a corner at the point 0, -2, and it's directly at that point of 4, -3. And so we need to just figure out, well, I need to figure out how do I get from this point to this point. So I would have to go down 1, so -1, and I would have to go to the right 4, so +4. So we say our slope, our change in y is -1, our change in x is +4. So our slope would be -1/4. Again, you can also see another ordered pair that we would have is -4, -1. So if these are the points, let me draw out our table. That way you can kind of see how that works. So we have -4, -1, we have 0, -2, and we have 4, -3. So notice our change in y we said is -1, and our change in x is +4. So notice the pattern. You can build that staircase. If you need to make the table, please do. Lastly, we have 2 last questions. So it says, what is the equation for the line graph below? So it's very similar to this problem in the bottom left. First, identify that y-intercept. Again, highlight your y-axis. That way you can see where it hits the y-axis. And so we're going to say, well, it hits at this point of -1. So we're going to say, all right, it's always going to be in the form y equals mx plus b. And so we say, all right, b is going to be -1. Then we have to figure out what is our slope. So we have to go from this point, and let's say, hey, it goes directly in a corner at this next point. So we can say, hey, how do I get from our y-intercept to this point, 3, 1? Well, I'd have to go up 2, so I have to say plus 2, and then in the x, I go plus 3. So we'd say our change in y, our change in x is going to be our slope. So our change in y is plus 2, our change in x is plus 3. So again, use these two sets of values to write our equation. So I have y equals, and I have m, which is going to be 2/3, and I have times x, which is our slope first, and then we have our y-intercept of -1. And then for this last one, it says this, it says which equation represents the same linear function in the table below. So what you can do, notice how there's no y-intercept here, but you can still find that slope. So this is just like the IXL section v.2. You can find that slope with a table of values. So let's have our change in y is going to be plus 8. Our change in x is going to be plus 2. So we say slope is going to be m. And so we say our change in y is 8 over 2. And so we can reduce that and say, hey, our slope has to be 4. And if we're looking at each of these equations, again, they're always in this form of y equals mx plus b. That means that our slope has to be 4 for this one. And so the only choice that we can choose from here is that top right one. So it's going to be this one right here. So our function for this is going to be y equals 4x plus 3. Again, you can check those values to make sure they work. As always, feel free to ask questions at any point in time. Otherwise, super slam that subscribe button.